The story begins in the blistering heat of the European summer of 1944, the roar of artillery echoing across hedgerows and shattered villages, where German soldiers dug trenches and lay prone behind shattered walls, clutching rifles and machine guns, their nerves taut as the wire entanglements that crisscrossed the fields like lethal spiderwebs. Across the horizon, the unmistakable, thunderous staccato of an American Browning M2 50 caliber machine gun cut through the chaos, each round a silver streak of death tearing through metal, wood and flesh alike, and in that moment, the soldiers knew instinctively that no ordinary rifle fire could compare, that no standard defensive emplacement could withstand the hail of bullets that seemed to come from nowhere yet everywhere at once. The way the heavy 50 caliber rounds chewed through sandbags, vehicle armor, and even light tank plating as though it were paper, and as the first burst erupted over a crumbling hedge, the young German conscripts, some barely 20, felt a chill that had nothing to do with the wind. They had trained for combat, marched for miles in heat and mud, fired thousands of rounds in practice, but this was something entirely different, something primal in its capacity to destroy. And as the M2's rapid fire cut down a half-track, attempting to maneuver through the shattered fields, the men ducked instinctively, hearts pounding, sweat running down their faces. And in that instant, the legend of the American heavy machine gun was born. Not through rumor or propaganda, but through a tangible, visceral fear that gripped every soldier who saw its effect firsthand. It was the sound of inevitability. The whine of pure kinetic force accelerated by meticulous engineering, the product of John Browning's genius and decades of refinement, and it was wielded by Americans who had learned to coordinate fire from multiple angles, suppressing entire sectors with sweeping arcs, using the gun's massive range, up to 2,000 yards, to dominate open fields, choke off retreat paths, and render every exposed vehicle and fortification a target for certain destruction. While the Germans scrambled to erect makeshift shields, digging deeper, piling sandbags, and improvising metal plates, yet all the while knowing in some deep, inescapable part of their minds that their defenses were laughably insufficient. Each burst seemed to punch through the world, each round a meteor of lead, tearing apart engines, flattening trucks, and splintering wooden doors with a sound like a percussion orchestra gone mad. While those who had once laughed at American infantry weapons now flinched at the mere glimpse of a tripod-mounted M2, and every commander in the field knew that encountering this gun in a skirmish was not merely an obstacle, it was a sentence, a reckoning, a tangible reminder that in modern warfare, the balance had shifted, that industrial capacity, engineering, and tactical deployment could render human courage almost meaningless. And as the German squads huddled in ruined barns or behind shattered hedgerows, they whispered among themselves of the monster gun, describing it in hushed, reverent tones, recounting how it had shredded a Panzerwaffel's thin side armor as if it were nothing more than cardboard, how its tracer rounds illuminated the night sky like streaks of fire, and how a single well-placed M2 could halt a company's advance, turning what should have been a coordinated assault into chaos, fear, and death. And in that same moment, while American gunners rotated their barrels, refilled belts, and maintained the rhythm of mechanical fury, the Germans began to understand why intelligence reports often underestimated the weapon's effectiveness, why those who had survived encounters described it as more than a gun, as an elemental force, a thunderstorm of lead and steel that demanded respect, fear, and ingenuity to counter. And yet even with all their experience and courage, the men could do little but scatter, hide, and pray that the next round would pass by harmlessly, because the M2 did not discriminate. It punished every error in positioning, every lapse in concealment, every underestimation of American firepower, and as rounds struck barns, knocked chimneys down, and tore apart machine gun nests, the Germans' psychological resilience eroded with each crack and ping, the legend of the 50 caliber weapon cementing itself in their minds, not as a tool of war but as a harbinger of death, a singular instrument that reshaped every battlefield it touched. And beyond the immediate carnage, the gun's very presence altered tactics, forcing platoons to spread wider, abandon traditional advance formations, and rethink everything they knew about suppressive fire. While American instructors and soldiers, knowing the fear it inspired, trained relentlessly to maximize its effectiveness, covering fields of fire with overlapping arcs, pairing gunners with spotters to correct aim and track movement, integrating the M2 into armored vehicles and half-tracks to bring mobile, unstoppable firepower to every encounter, and even mounting it on aircraft to terrorize ground troops, ensuring that from land, sea, and air, the M2 dictated the terms of engagement. As the German soldiers experienced it, what had once been abstract reports or intelligence sketches became a living nightmare as they watched comrades fall in seconds, vehicles incinerated, and entire attacks grind to a halt under withering fire. And in those moments, the understanding was clear. This was not merely a weapon. It was a statement of industrialized war, of engineering excellence, and of the terrifying calculus that American forces had mastered, blending accuracy, rate of fire, range, and psychological dominance into a single instrument. And so the fear spread beyond individual battles, beyond individual platoons, seeding itself into the doctrine of retreat, into whispered warnings along the front lines, into the morale of units already battered by relentless Allied pressure, until the very name M250 Cal evoked a visceral reaction, eyes widening, bodies lowering, hearts hammering, and in every field, every forest, every ruin where it appeared, German soldiers felt the cold certainty that no armor, no cover, no clever maneuver could truly escape its reach. And even as they regrouped, calculated, and attempted to counter, the reality remained inescapable. The American M2 was a mechanized thunderbolt, a rolling, firing judgment that had transformed the European battlefield into a crucible of fear, respect, and awe, and in the minds of those who faced it, they could not unsee its power, could not unhear its roar, could not undo the knowledge that survival against it required a miracle, ingenuity, or the grace of chance. And in the quiet moments, when the wind rustled through shattered villages and the echoes of gunfire faded, the veterans of those encounters would remember the first time the M2 cut through the air like lightning, a sound that forever marked the beginning of the end for any soldier foolish enough to underestimate the sheer devastation it could bring. For the M250 Cal was more than ammunition and metal. It was the embodiment of American industrial ingenuity, tactical supremacy, and a psychological weapon whose legend lived on long after the smoke cleared and the fields fell silent. As dawn broke over the shattered European countryside, the American M250 caliber heavy machine guns hummed with anticipation, their barrels glinting in the early sunlight, casting long shadows over the muddy foxholes and ruined villages where German soldiers still clung desperately to any semblance of cover. And in that quiet, tense moment before the first rounds flew, the men knew instinctively that the fate of their day's engagement would be dictated not by courage alone, but by the cold, mechanical inevitability of the weapon's thunderous presence. The M2's engineers had designed it with precision, a balance of weight, power, and rate of fire that allowed it to sweep entire fields with a single disciplined operator. And as American gunners adjusted their tripods, loaded belts, and synchronized their fire with spotters and armored reconnaissance units, the Germans observed with a growing sense of dread, their eyes widening at the sheer scale and volume of fire they would soon face. And as the first bursts erupted, tearing into sandbags, trees, and vehicles alike, the soldiers flinched, crouched lower, and whispered among themselves, sharing the grim reality that no ordinary countermeasure could withstand this force, while the bullets tore through hedgerows with terrifying precision, shredding wooden doors, puncturing roofs, and cutting through anything less than reinforced steel. And as half-tracks attempted to maneuver, they were shredded from the sides, engines igniting in sudden flashes of flame, crews thrown violently into the mud, their screams mingling with the metallic roar of lead and the acrid scent of burning fuel. In those first moments of engagement, entire squads were scattered, their formation broken, morale strained to its limits as the M2 continued its relentless rhythm, and commanders who had trained their men for weeks realized that the conventional tactics of entrenchment and concentrated fire were no longer sufficient, that the American weapon had introduced a new variable into the battlefield equation, one that demanded adaptation or death. And as the day progressed, the Germans found themselves improvising constantly, digging deeper, hiding behind vehicles, even attempting to use fallen walls as shields. Yet the M2's range and power rendered many of these measures useless, each burst capable of penetrating multiple obstacles, shredding engines, and creating psychological shockwaves that rippled through the lines. And in this crucible, the fear became contagious, spreading from one platoon to the next, as soldiers witnessed comrades torn apart before their eyes, vehicles flattened, and positions overrun not by overwhelming numbers but by the concentrated, merciless hail of 50 caliber fire, while the Americans, confident in their engineering and tactics, coordinated overlapping fields of fire, ensuring that any attempted German advance would be met by multiple arcs of bullets. Converging with near-perfect timing, and in the air above, mounted M2s on aircraft provided strafing runs that added to the terror below, their rounds slicing through the morning mist and into anything that dared move, a flying extension of the same relentless ground-based destruction. And as the Germans adapted, learned, and tried to counteract with mortars, artillery, and counter-snipers, they realized with chilling clarity that the M2's effectiveness was not merely in its rate of fire or penetration power, but in the way it dominated psychology, forcing hesitation, miscalculation, and terror, as even small movements could provoke instant, deadly response. And while officers shouted commands, reordered units, and attempted to maintain cohesion, the ever-present threat of the 50 caliber machine gun rendered much of their planning irrelevant, as the bullets seemed to anticipate their maneuvers, forcing retreats, misfires, and chaotic withdrawals. While every American gun crew trained meticulously in aiming, reloads, barrel swaps, and synchronization, acted like parts of a larger organism, each movement precise, mechanical, and devastatingly effective, turning individual skill into multiplied lethality. And as the sun climbed higher, casting shadows across bombed-out villages, the German soldiers' fear crystallized into awe and horror, for they could see, feel, and almost hear the weapon's presence in every crack of timber, in every shattered stone wall, and in every whine of fleeing vehicle wheels, realizing in that gut-wrenching moment that the M250 cal was not just a tool of war, but an omnipresent force, reshaping every battlefield, dictating every engagement, and leaving a trail of destruction and psychological scars that would endure far beyond the immediate carnage, proving without question why German soldiers had feared it above all other weapons, and why stories of its effectiveness had circulated through every command, whispered in bunkers, and recounted with dread around campfires, because nothing else so consistently combined accuracy, range, and psychological impact into a single, unstoppable instrument. And as night fell over the scarred fields, with smoke rising from burned-out half-tracks, smoldering barns, and fallen trees riddled with bullets, the Americans finally ceased fire, but the echoes of the M2's roar lingered in the ears, hearts and minds of every German soldier who had survived. A chilling reminder that technological supremacy, when wielded with skill and precision, could render courage insufficient, human numbers inadequate, and conventional tactics obsolete. And as the last embers glowed in the twilight, commanders of both sides reflected on the day's events, knowing that history would record the M250 cal not merely as a gun, but as a defining instrument of World War II battlefields, the weapon that had turned fear into legend, battle into spectacle, and soldiers' lives into testament to the relentless calculus of industrialized war. And in those moments, as the stars began to pierce the night sky, the men understood that survival had been dictated not by chance, not by bravery, but by the mastery of one weapon. And the lesson was clear. Underestimate the M250 cal at your own peril, because its thunder would not forgive, its bullets would not discriminate, and its legend would endure long after the smoke cleared. The dawn broke over the shattered landscape of Normandy, the air thick with the scent of wet earth, smoke, and the lingering metallic tang of spent ammunition, as the American M250 caliber machine guns once again took their positions, mounted atop Sherman tanks, half-tracks, and fortified emplacements, and every German soldier who had survived the previous day's onslaught knew instinctively that nothing would be the same. Whispers ran through the ranks, officers muttering grimly about the devil's gun, while men instinctively ducked lower in foxholes and behind rubble, their eyes scanning the horizon for the unmistakable glint of its barrels or the telltale glimmer of its sighting optics. And as the first bursts rang out, tearing through wooden crates, sandbags, and thin metal roofs, the rhythm of battle became an unrelenting heartbeat. Mechanical and cold, each round a hammer blow to nerves, morale, and flesh. And the M2 crews moved with practiced precision, swapping barrels as they heated, feeding belts with machine-like coordination, and laying down overlapping fields of fire that forced the Germans to scatter, retreat, or be obliterated. While artillery could not compensate, mortars fell short, and every maneuver seemed anticipated, the bullets tracing arcs of inevitability, cutting through hedgerows, destroying vehicles, shredding communications lines, and forcing every unit to confront the merciless calculus of industrialized warfare. And yet amidst the chaos, a strange, silent awe grew even among the terrified defenders, as the weapon's effectiveness was undeniable, a testament to design, engineering, and human discipline working in perfect harmony, a force that could transform small squads into strategic powerhouses. And as German officers attempted to organize counterattacks, they realized that even massed rifle fire, grenades, and attempted flanking movements were futile, the M2's reach and stopping power rendering their plans almost meaningless. While from the air, American P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs, each armed with paired M2s in synchronized strafing runs, turned open fields into sheets of fire and smoke, reducing fortified positions to craters, destroying supply lines, and cutting off retreating units in ways that left the Germans both horrified and powerless. And as the day wore on, the psychological effect compounded, the constant staccato of the gun's reports embedding itself into memory, creating a relentless, inescapable terror that hampered decision-making, slowed reaction times, and made each soldier hesitate at the exact moment precision and speed were required. A delay that the Americans exploited ruthlessly, and when night fell, the surviving German units huddled in wreckage and shell holes, counting the dead, trying to make sense of what had occurred, realizing with haunting clarity that technology, logistics, and coordinated execution had triumphed over courage, tenacity, and even superior numbers, as the M2 had rewritten the battlefield's rules. And in quiet moments, when the wind whispered through the torn hedgerows and scorched fields, soldiers understood why the weapon had been feared, why it had been the bane of previous campaigns, and why every account, every report, and every whispered story of its effect had been accurate, as the M250 caliber machine gun had not merely inflicted casualties, it had shattered morale, redefined tactics, and become a symbol of the terrifying marriage of industrial might and battlefield ingenuity. And as the first stars pierced the dark sky over the ruined villages, with smoldering wrecks and bodies still littering the fields, American crews cleaned their weapons, rotated ammunition belts, and prepared for the next day, their minds calm but their hearts steady, knowing they wielded more than steel and gunpowder. They wielded inevitability. And the Germans, for all their training and valor, could do nothing but endure, flee, or perish, leaving behind the indelible lesson that the M250 caliber was not merely a weapon of war, but a force that dominated the senses, the landscape, and the mind, turning the very concept of survival into a question answered only by who commanded the thunder of its relentless fire. And as the last echoes faded into the night, a grim truth settled over the battlefield. The Americans had mastered the art of combining men, machinery, and strategy, and the Germans had learned, often too late, that no bravery, no cunning, and no numbers could withstand the unyielding judgment of the M250 caliber, whose shadow loomed over every tree, every bunker, and every heart, a reminder that in modern warfare, supremacy belonged to those who could combine firepower, precision, and psychological dominance into one unstoppable force. The morning fog clung to the shattered countryside like a ghostly shroud, and as the first light crept over the horizon, the American M250 caliber crews were already at their positions, their weapons glinting wetly with dew, the belt-fed monsters poised to pour fire over anything daring to move. And for the German soldiers, the sight was almost surreal. These weren't mere guns, they were heralds of death, barrels rising like sentinels over tree lines, and the men who operated them moved with a precision that seemed almost unnatural, loading belts, adjusting sights, communicating silently with gestures honed by countless drills, their every movement a prelude to chaos for the approaching enemy. And as the Germans attempted to regroup and form lines, the first burst shattered the morning calm, tracer rounds streaking like deadly ribbons through the mist, tearing into transport trucks, horse-drawn wagons, and the thin wooden barricades meant to offer protection. And the soldiers who had braved so many engagements now found themselves hesitating, hearts hammering, instincts screaming that survival was no longer a matter of courage, for the M2's range and power rendered bold movements suicidal. And as machine gun fire ripped across the fields, shredding trees and sending debris into the fog, even artillery could not compensate. The bullets were faster, more accurate, and completely unpredictable to the defenders, cutting communication lines, splitting squads, and creating confusion in every company, while the psychological toll was as lethal as the physical. Men flinching, tripping over craters, and falling into shell holes, paralyzed by the knowledge that each sound, each crack of the gun, could mean instant death, and above them, American aircraft strafed in perfect synchronization, their twin M2s spitting fire into anything resembling movement, forcing survivors to huddle and whisper, realizing that every path of retreat had become a funnel for death. And the entire German advance began to crumble, cohesion lost in a storm of steel and smoke. And yet amidst this devastation, the American gunners remained composed, calculating, almost serene, observing the effects of their fire, adjusting elevation, leading shots, and ensuring that each burst of fire reinforced the others. A symphony of destruction orchestrated with deadly precision, and as the battle raged on, the terrain itself became a testament to the M2's dominance. Fields torn to mud, hedgerows flattened, buildings reduced to skeletal frames, and every mark of carnage a permanent record of what industrialized weaponry could accomplish against traditional infantry tactics. While the German officers, many of whom had faced the M2 in Italy and North Africa, now fully comprehended its unmatched efficiency, their respect tinged with terror, realizing that the American machine gun was not only lethal in its mechanics, but devastating in its psychological impact, capable of breaking morale before the bullets even struck. And as the day wore on, survivors recounted the stories of comrades cut down from hundreds of yards, of entire squads forced to scatter, of leadership silenced, all under the relentless, unyielding thunder of the .50 caliber, and in the quiet lulls between barrages, the soldiers could hear the faint whine of cooling barrels, the clatter of spent casings, the whispered prayers of those hiding in ruins. And through it all, a singular truth became clear. In this war of firepower, the M2 was an instrument of inevitability, a weapon that turned numbers, training, and bravery into futile gestures, and by nightfall, when the smoke drifted into the dark sky and the ground was littered with the remnants of the day's assault, the German soldiers who survived would speak in hushed tones, telling each other that no weapon they had faced, no tactic they had prepared, could compare to the unrelenting presence of the American .50 caliber, whose shadow had fallen over every battlefield, every foxhole and every shattered mind. And as the stars blinked into view above the scarred earth, the American crews cleaned, oiled, and reloaded, their faces calm. Knowing they had wielded more than mere bullets, they had wielded dominance, control, and the unshakable authority of precision-engineered terror. And for those who had seen it, felt it, and survived it, the M250 caliber would forever remain a symbol of power, an embodiment of industrial might, a reminder that in modern warfare, firepower was the ultimate arbiter of life and death. And all who faced it, whether in verdant fields, bombed-out villages, or shattered hedgerows, understood that the legend of the M2 was earned not in stories, but in the blood, courage, and shattered formations of those who encountered it and lived only to recount its terrifying efficacy. The morning fog had barely lifted when the American M250 caliber crews returned to their positions, the wet earth still reeking of spent powder and scorched metal. And as they set up along the ridge, the German infantry advanced cautiously, boots sinking into mud, weapons raised but nerves fraying, because the memory of the last engagement haunted every step, every glance at the tree line, every rustle of grass a potential herald of death. And the American gunners, calm and methodical, loaded belts with the precision of watchmakers, each link of ammunition a promise of devastation. And when the first bursts rang out, tracer rounds painting arcs through the sky, the soldiers on the receiving end instinctively dove, shouted, and scrambled for cover, realizing again that courage alone could not withstand the power these guns unleashed, that every movement could be their last. And yet the Americans didn't merely fire. They choreographed, adjusting angles, leading targets, and timing volleys so that enemy formations were shredded before they could even react. And the field itself became a testament to controlled chaos, mud churned by the fallen, splintered wood and shattered stone marking every line of advance. The psychological warfare as effective as the physical, as officers shouted commands, but men faltered, hesitated, and fell, seeing comrades cut down by the invisible rain of bullets, and the roar of the guns mixed with the groans of the wounded and the distant echo of artillery, creating a soundscape that seemed almost alive, wrapping around the Germans like a predator closing in. And as the day progressed, every maneuver, every attempted flank, was anticipated and neutralized by the precision and range of the .50 caliber, a weapon that redefined the battlefield and forced tactical adaptation under fire. While the American crews, serene amidst the storm, analyzed each response, noted every weakness, and adjusted their aim, their discipline turning what might have been mere slaughter into a surgical eradication of enemy momentum, and the Germans, hardened by years of conflict, found themselves paralyzed, understanding that the rules had changed, that the M2 was not merely a gun, but a statement of technological dominance, its bullets faster, more penetrating, and psychologically shattering, capable of halting entire battalions and disintegrating morale before a single bayonet clash. And as dusk approached, the air was thick with smoke, the scent of cordite and blood mingling, and the survivors crawled back to regroup, whispering to one another in disbelief, recounting how volleys of metal had torn through ranks like a scythe, leaving fields littered with both men and equipment. Yet the Americans, meticulous in maintenance even as fatigue set in, cleaned and oiled the barrels, prepared new belts, and reviewed maps, planning the next day's positions with the same unwavering resolve. And by nightfall, as stars emerged over the war-torn landscape, the M2 had not only inflicted unprecedented casualties, but rewritten the very psychology of those who faced it, instilling a combination of awe and terror that would echo long after the echoes of gunfire faded. And in whispered conversations around dimly lit encampments, German soldiers admitted that the American .50 caliber was more than a weapon. It was a specter of precision, an embodiment of relentless power, and a lesson in the devastating consequences of underestimating technology, a lesson they would carry with them for the remainder of the war, a reminder that in modern combat, courage without preparation, skill without support, and bravery without understanding of enemy capability could be rendered meaningless in the blink of an M2's muzzle flash. And as the American crews finally rested, their figures silhouetted against burning skies and shattered terrain, they knew they had wielded not just machinery but supremacy, a force that transcended mere firepower to become the ultimate arbiter of survival. And for those who witnessed its might, whether in the heat of engagement or in the silent aftermath, the legend of the M250 caliber would endure, a symbol of lethal efficiency, technological mastery, and the terrifying beauty of controlled destruction on the battlefield. Dawn broke over the shattered fields of Europe, a pale, cold light illuminating mud craters, and the scattered remnants of what had been a German advance, and in the distance, the silhouettes of American M250 caliber crews moved with practiced efficiency, their rifles mounted on bipods, belts of ammunition clicking as they were fed into the waiting barrels, a rhythmic anticipation that seemed almost ceremonial, almost holy. And as the first German scouts appeared over the ridge, eyes scanning for weaknesses, they froze mesmerized, unprepared for what came next. For the roar of the '50s was unlike anything they had experienced, a voice of destruction that cut through the fog, a wave of sound and fury that seemed to bend the very air, and the bullets tore through armor and flesh alike, sending men sprawling, rifles clattering, and horses rearing in terror, the cacophony a brutal symphony of modern warfare. And as more waves of German soldiers pressed forward, the American gunners adjusted, trained on every movement, anticipating formations, reading intentions with uncanny precision, every burst a calculation, every tracer a line drawn between life and death. And the Germans, seasoned veterans of Blitzkrieg, realized too late that tactics learned over years of fighting were useless against the relentless, screaming hail of 50-caliber rounds, that bravery alone could not save them from annihilation, that the battlefield itself had become a crucible where courage, fear, and technology collided in a way that left no room for error. And the Americans, calm amid the chaos, watched as enemy squads faltered, broke ranks, and fell. Their screams swallowed by the engine roar and metallic thunder, each report reinforcing the terrifying reputation of the weapon they wielded. And in those moments, the battlefield seemed suspended between life and death, silence and storm, the landscape carved by fire and metal, the sky above streaked with smoke and tracer arcs, the earth below a tapestry of devastation. And yet amidst the carnage, discipline held firm, every American soldier understanding the balance of power in his hands, the cruel efficiency of each shot, the weight of survival measured in rounds and breath. And as the last of the German waves faltered, retreating under a storm of punishment, the M2 crews reloaded calmly, scanning, alert, knowing the fight could resume at any second, the very presence of their weapon shaping the battlefield even when silence returned. And in the aftermath, when the smoke cleared and the dead and wounded were accounted for, the Germans whispered among themselves, eyes wide, voices trembling, recounting the horror they had just survived. And the legend of the American 50 caliber cemented itself as a machine of fear, precision, and inevitability. A weapon so powerful that it didn't just kill, it dictated the terms of engagement, rewrote the psychology of combat, and left every enemy who faced it in a state of stunned reverence. And as the Americans walked among the ruined landscape, checking belts, cleaning barrels, and offering quiet respect to their fallen comrades, they understood that this was more than a battle won, more than a weapon deployed. It was history in motion, a final, unrelenting testament to technological dominance, discipline, and the brutal poetry of survival under fire. And long after the echoes of gunfire faded into the cold European dawn, the fear, respect, and awe inspired by the M2 50 caliber would linger, whispered in barracks, written in memoirs, remembered in eyes that had stared down its muzzle flash. A permanent imprint of lethal efficiency and the terrifying truth that in modern war, the deadliest weapon is often the one that cannot be ignored, the one whose power dictates the dance of life and death, the one that forever changed the battlefield in the hands of those who knew how to wield it with precision, patience, and unyielding resolve.